She ran through the velvet curtains of the sapphire lounge with blood streaking her face and fever burning in her small hands, straight toward the man the city called Iron Orchid, the one person everyone knew showed no mercy. "They're killing my mama," the 6-year-old sobbed, clutching his expensive sleeve. What Kongdae did next shattered his 15-year legacy of ruthlessness and exposed a betrayal that would reshape the entire underworld, and the twist he revealed in that kitchen left everyone speechless. It was a hushed evening in the heart of the city's Shadow District, inside the Sapphire Lounge, a place where power was traded in whispers, fear was currency, and vulnerability meant death. This was Kongdae's empire, the most calculated Korean-American mafia boss the city had ever known, a man who ruled through ice-cold logic and unwavering control. For 15 years, nothing had penetrated the armor around his conscience. Until a little girl in a blood-stained pink dress burst through the door, in front of his mother, and forced him to choose between the monster he'd become and the man he used to be. They called him Iron Orchid, and the name was meant to be mocking at first, a delicate flower with the strength of steel. But Kongdae had taken the insult and transformed it into legend. An orchid was beautiful, rare, and required perfect conditions to thrive. But beneath its elegance, it was a parasite, draining life from everything it touched to survive. That was how he ran his territory. Calculated, efficient, merciless. The stories about him were told in hushed tones in back alleys and corner stores. There was the accountant who skimmed $3,000. Kongdae didn't kill him, but made him hand-deliver envelopes to the man's own family for 6 months, each one containing a smaller portion of his debt, each visit a reminder that mercy was a myth. There was the rival crew who tried to move product through his district. They woke up to find their entire operation dismantled, their contacts turned, their money redistributed to Kongdae's network before sunrise. No bullets. No bodies. Just complete and total erasure. He believed in a philosophy he'd articulated only once, to a lieutenant who'd questioned an order: emotion is a weed. It grows fast, looks harmless, and before you know it, it's strangled everything you built. You pull it out by the roots, or you lose the garden. For 15 years, that garden had flourished under his cold, steady hand. But tonight, across the table, sat the one person who could make him remember what it felt like to be something other than iron. Martha Park had steel-gray hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and she wore a navy dress that spoke of old money and older dignity. She was his American mother, the woman who'd taken in a teenage boy with blood on his hands and rage in his heart, and had somehow convinced him that survival didn't have to mean becoming a monster. She'd failed, of course. Or at least, that's what Kongdae told himself. Yet here they were, like they were every third Tuesday, a standing dinner reservation that no business could interrupt, no emergency could cancel. She never asked about his work directly. She asked about his health, whether he was sleeping, if he'd read the book she'd sent him. And he answered honestly, because lying to Martha Park felt more dangerous than facing down a rival boss. "You look tired, Kongdae," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that made his chest tighten in ways a gun never could. "It's a busy season," he replied, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. "Busy keeping the weeds pulled?" There was no judgment in her voice, only a sad knowing. He met her eyes then, the same gray as her hair, the same steel as his reputation. She knew exactly what he was. And she loved him anyway. That was the crack in his armor he could never quite seal. The sound came first, a crash from the entrance, the splintering of the carefully maintained silence that made the Sapphire Lounge what it was. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every head in the room turned toward the velvet curtains that separated the elite dining area from the rest of the world. Then she appeared. A child, no more than 6 years old, in a pink dress that had once been pristine. Now it was streaked with something dark and wet. Her face was a canvas of terror, blood smeared across her left cheek, tears cutting clean paths through the grime, small hands trembling as they reached forward like a drowning person grasping for a lifeline. She didn't run to the exit. She didn't cry for help to the room at large. Her eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto Kongdae with a kind of certainty that only children possess, the belief that adults can fix anything, even when every adult in the room knew better. "Please." Her voice was raw, shredded by screaming. "They're killing my mama. They're killing her." She stumbled forward, her small body colliding with the edge of their table hard enough to rattle the crystal. Her burning hands, fever-hot and sticky with blood that wasn't hers, latched onto Kongdae's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please, mister, please. She's in the kitchen and they won't stop and there's so much blood." Two of his bodyguards materialized from the shadows like sharks smelling chum. Jean moved first, his massive hand reaching down to pry the child away from his boss. Protocol was clear: no one touched Kongdae uninvited. Especially not a hysterical bleeding child who'd somehow breached 3 levels of security. But before Jin's fingers could close around the girl's thin arm, Kongdae raised his left hand, just 2 fingers, a gesture so small it barely qualified as movement. Jean froze mid-reach. His partner, Marcus, stopped a full step behind, reading the command that hadn't needed words. The entire restaurant held its breath. Kongdae looked down at the small creature attached to his $4,000 suit. Her eyes were brown, he noticed, the kind of brown that still held innocence, that hadn't yet learned that the world was designed to crush people like her mother. Like his mother had been, once. Like he had been, before Martha. "They're killing her," Lily whispered again, her voice breaking. "Please. You're the boss. You can make them stop." The logic was childish and perfect. He was the boss. He could make anything stop. Around them, the ambient noise of the Sapphire Lounge had evaporated entirely. Forks rested on plates. Deals hung suspended in mid-negotiation. Every dangerous man in the room watched to see what Iron Orchid would do when confronted with something that couldn't be intimidated, bought, or eliminated: pure, desperate, innocent need. Kongdae felt Martha's gaze on him like a physical weight. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Because he knew exactly what he'd see in those steel-gray eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure which version of himself would win. The moment stretched. Lily's small fingers dug deeper into the silk of his sleeve, leaving impressions that would outlast the bloodstains. Her breathing came in ragged gasps, each one a countdown to something irreversible happening in the kitchen behind the walls. Finally, he raised his eyes to meet his mother's. Martha Park hadn't moved. Her hands remained folded on the table, her posture unchanged. But everything in her face had shifted, not into anger or disappointment, but into something far more devastating: recognition. She was looking at him the way she had 17 years ago, when he'd shown up at her church shelter with split knuckles and a knife wound in his side, trying to decide whether to ask for help or just take what he needed. She'd made him a deal that night. She told him that strength without conscience wasn't strength at all, it was just fear wearing a different mask. He'd thought he'd outgrown that weakness. Built something better. Something that lasted. Now her silence asked him a question he couldn't pretend not to understand. What kind of man pulls weeds but lets a flower die right in front of him? The air between them crystallized into a conversation that needed no words. Her slight movement, just the barest tilt of her head toward the crying child, wasn't a suggestion. It was a reminder. Not of what he owed her, but of what he'd promised himself he would never become. His biological mother had been a waitress too. Had worked doubles in places like this, places where powerful men made decisions that crushed people like insects. He'd been 8 years old when she hadn't come home one night. When the police had found her in an alley behind a restaurant, beaten for being in the wrong place when the wrong conversation happened. No one had helped her. No one had intervened. Because no one thought a waitress was worth the risk. Martha had told him that story back to him once, years later, when he'd first started building his empire. She'd said, "You survived that night, Kongdae. But who did you decide to become because of it? The man who could have saved her, or the man who wouldn't have bothered?" He'd never answered her. Had told himself the question was irrelevant, that the world didn't work on should-haves and what-ifs. But Martha Park had a gift for asking questions that waited patiently in the dark until the exact moment you couldn't avoid them anymore. Lily's voice cracked through his memory. "Please. You can make them stop." Martha's eyes held his. Not pleading. Not commanding. Simply waiting to see which seed she'd planted in him had taken deeper root. The one that taught him to survive at any cost, or the one that whispered that survival without humanity wasn't survival at all. He looked down at the child. Then back at Martha. Then at the kitchen door where a woman was dying while he performed calculations about reputation and risk. The Iron Orchid died in that moment, strangled by the very philosophy that had created it. "Jean," Kongdae said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The kitchen. Now." He stood, and Lily's hands fell away from his sleeve, leaving ghost prints of blood and fever on the fabric. Martha remained seated, but he felt her presence at his back like a shield as he moved through the restaurant. Jean and Marcus fell into formation, 3 steps behind, close enough to act, far enough to let him lead. The velvet curtains, the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers. All of it dissolved as Kongdae pushed through the swinging door that separated the world of the Sapphire Lounge from the machinery that made it function. The kitchen hit him like a physical assault. The elegant silence of the dining room died the moment he crossed the threshold. Here, the air was thick with steam and heat, the cloying smell of cooking oil mixing with something sharper, more metallic. Blood, sweat, fear. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and buzzed, casting everything in a harsh clinical glow that made shadows twist into accusatory shapes. He heard her before he saw her. A woman's voice, already hoarse from screaming, reduced now to a wet, bubbling plea. "Please, I have the money, I can get it, please stop." The dining room had been a stage set. This was reality. 3 men stood in a rough circle near the industrial dishwasher, their backs blocking his view of whoever was on the floor between them. They wore casual clothes, but Kongdae recognized the way they stood, the practiced distribution of weight that came from years of delivering violence. Not amateurs. Not random thugs who'd wandered in off the street. The one on the left held a lead pipe, its surface dark with fresh blood. The one in the center gripped the woman by her hair, holding her head up like a trophy. The third had his foot pressed against her ribs, pinning her to the tile floor that was slick with something that reflected the fluorescent lights in nauseating patterns. She was still alive. Barely. Her waitress uniform, the same crisp white shirt and black slacks that every server in the Sapphire Lounge wore, was torn and soaked through. Her face was a ruin of split skin and swelling, one eye already sealed shut, blood running from her nose and mouth in steady streams. But her remaining eye found him. Recognized him. And in that moment he saw the same terrible calculation he'd seen in Lily's face, the desperate, impossible hope that the monster might save you instead of devour you. The 3 men turned at the sound of the door, and that's when Kongdae felt his blood turn to ice water. He knew them. Not just knew them. He'd promoted them. The one with the pipe was Yuri Volkov, his enforcement coordinator. The one holding her hair was Thomas Chun, head of his collection. Operations. The third, with his boot on her ribs, was David Park, no relation to Martha, but someone Kongdae had personally recruited 3 years ago for his efficiency and discretion. His own men. His trusted officers. In his restaurant. Beating a woman to death over what? "Boss," Yuri said, lowering the pipe slowly. His voice carried no guilt, no fear. Just mild surprise at the interruption. "We're handling a collection issue. Be done in a minute." A collection issue. The words hung in the superheated air of the kitchen like a confession written in blood. Kongdae stood perfectly still, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the architecture of betrayal. Yuri Volkov. Enforcement coordinator. The man Kongdae had pulled from a street gang 5 years ago and molded into something resembling professionalism. He'd given Yuri structure, purpose, a salary that let him move his mother out of a roach-infested walk-up. And Yuri had repaid him with loyalty. Or so Kongdae had believed. Thomas Chun. Collections. Brilliant with numbers, ruthless with deadlines, but always proportional. Chin understood that fear was a tool, not a philosophy. That you squeezed, but you didn't crush, because crushed people couldn't pay. Kongdae had trusted him with the financial skeleton keys to the entire Operation Dell. David Park. The newest of the 3, but the one Kongdae had seen the most potential in. Smart enough to know when violence was necessary and disciplined enough to know when it wasn't. Or that's what his file had said. What Kongdae had believed. 3 men he'd elevated. 3 men who reported directly to him. 3 men who were currently standing in the back of his flagship restaurant, beating a waitress to death while he ate dinner with his mother 20 feet away. The implications crystallized with horrifying clarity. A collection issue, Kongdae repeated, his voice so quiet that all 3 men instinctively leaned forward to hear it. In my restaurant. During dinner service. Without clearance. Without protocol. Yuri's expression flickered, the first crack in his casual confidence. "Boss, it's just, She was short on her payment. We gave her extensions. She kept her payment. Kongdae's eyes moved to the woman on the floor. She was still conscious, her one good eye tracking the conversation with the desperate attention of someone watching a judge decide between execution and reprieve. Jean, check her file. Jean pulled out a tablet, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. 30 seconds of silence broken only by the woman's labored breathing and the hum of industrial refrigerators. Then Jin's face went very still. Boss, there's no file on her. No registered payment plan. No collection schedule. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 20 degrees. No file, Kongdae said softly. He looked at Thomas Chun, the collections specialist. How does someone owe money to an operation you run without having a file? Chen's mouth opened. Closed. His hand released the woman's hair and she collapsed fully to the floor, her body making a sound like a sack of broken glass. It's a side operation, David Park said suddenly, his voice too loud, too defensive. Independent revenue stream. We were going to bring it to you once it was independent. The word tasted like poison. You're running protection rackets. In my territory. Using my name. Without my knowledge. It wasn't a question. The three men exchanged glances, and in those glances, Kongdae saw the entire conspiracy laid bare. This wasn't a rogue beating. This was a shadow empire growing like mold in the dark spaces of his organization. How many other businesses were they bleeding? How many other people were paying tribute to ghosts wearing his reputation like a mask? The shocker wasn't what he was going to do to these men. The shocker was realizing that his philosophy, his iron control, his merciless efficiency, had created the perfect conditions for this rot to flourish. Kongdae moved forward, his expensive shoes making soft sounds against the blood-slicked tile. He crouched beside the woman, close enough to see the rapid flutter of her pulse in her throat, the way her fingers twitched against the floor as if searching for something to hold on to. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Mid-30s maybe. The same age his biological mother had been. How much, he asked, not looking at the three men. Silence. How much was she short? Boss, it's not about the amount, Yuri started. How much? Thomas Chen's voice came out strangled. $67. The number hung in the air like an obscenity. $67. Kongdae remained crouched, staring at the woman's ruined face. $67. The price of the truffle risotto appetizer in his dining room. Less than the cost of a single bottle of the wine he kept in stock for important clients. The same amount he'd probably left as a tip for their server tonight without thinking twice about it. They had beaten this woman, beaten her badly enough that the whites of her visible eye were completely red, that her breathing sounded like liquid, that her daughter had run screaming through a restaurant full of killers because she thought her mother was dying, over an amount of money that wouldn't buy a decent steak in his lounge. What's your name? He asked the woman softly. She tried to speak, but only blood came out. Her hand moved, trembling, pointing weakly toward a locker against the far wall. Jean moved to it, pulled it open, retrieved a small purse. Inside, a wallet. He pulled out a driver's license and read it aloud. Sarah Morrison. Age 34. Address on Bridgeport Avenue. Bridgeport. The neighborhood where Kongdae had grown up. Where his mother had worked herself to death. Where people like Sarah Morrison worked double shifts and still came up short because the math of survival was designed to never quite balance. And the payment schedule? Kongdae asked, his voice perfectly level. How much were you charging her? Another silence. Longer this time. 200. Monthly. David Park's voice was barely audible. Kongdae did the math. Sarah Morrison made maybe $30,000 a year as a waitress, if she was lucky. Probably less. $200 a month was groceries. Was keeping the lights on. Was the difference between Lily having winter clothes or not. And these three men he'd trusted, men he'd elevated, men who drove cars worth more than Sarah's annual salary, had implemented a system that extracted blood money from people who had nothing left to give. Then beat them to death when they came up short by the cost of an appetizer. He stood slowly, his knees cracking in the silence. When he turned to face Yuri, Thomas and David, Something in his expression made all three of them take an involuntary step backward. $67, Kongdae said quietly. You were going to kill her for $67. In my restaurant. Using my name. While I ate dinner 20 feet away. He paused, and the pause stretched like a blade against skin. Get Jean to call an ambulance. Then follow me. All three of you. We're going to the docks. The call went out at 10:47 p.m. 3 words from Jin's phone to every captain in Kongdae's organization. Docks. Midnight. Mandatory. By 11:30, the warehouse at Pier 19 was filled with the nervous energy of predators sensing a shift in the hierarchy. 17 captains stood in a loose semicircle under flickering industrial lights, their breath visible in the cold air that rolled off Lake Michigan. No one sat. No one spoke above a whisper. They all knew what midnight meetings at the docks meant. Someone was about to disappear. The warehouse smelled of rust and old fish, of diesel fuel and decades of things rotting in dark water. The concrete floor was stained with substances no one talked about, and in the far corner, a drain cover sat slightly askew, a reminder that disposal was always an option when problems needed permanent solutions. Kongdae arrived at 11:58, flanked by Jean and Marcus. Behind them Yuri, Thomas, and David walked with the glazed expressions of men who'd already calculated their odds and found them wanting. The assembled captains tracked their entrance with predatory attention, noting the formation, reading the body language, making their own calculations about what came next. The Iron Orchid was holding court. Kongdae stopped in the center of the semicircle. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the silence build until it became a physical presence, pressing down on everyone in the room. Outside, the sound of water lapping against pier posts created a rhythm like a heartbeat counting down. Yuri Volkov, Thomas Chin, David Park, he said finally, his voice carrying without volume. Step forward. The 3 men moved into the center of the circle. Yuri's jaw was set. Thomas wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. David's hands were shaking badly enough that he'd shoved them into his pockets. Tonight, I discovered these men running an unauthorized protection operation. Extorting local businesses. Using my name as leverage. Collecting money that was never logged, never reported, never sanctioned. Kongdae paused, letting each sentence land like a hammer blow. They beat a waitress nearly to death over $67 while I ate dinner in the same building. A murmur rippled through the assembled captains. This wasn't just about rogue operators. This was about fundamental betrayal of the organizational structure. Freelancing was cancer. It spread. And everyone in this room understood that when cancer was discovered, it had to be cut out completely. I want every captain here to understand what I found tonight, Kongdae continued. These men looked at my organization and saw an opportunity to build their own empire in the shadows. They looked at the people under my protection and saw prey. They looked at their oaths of loyalty and saw suggestions. He began to pace, a slow circle around the 3 men, and the captains instinctively leaned back, giving him space. For 15 years, I've built something that works. Something efficient. Something feared. I've pulled weeds religiously. I've maintained order. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. But tonight I realized something. The worst weeds aren't the ones that grow wild. They're the ones that look like flowers until you examine them closely. The parasites that wrap around your foundation and hollow it out from within. He stopped pacing. Turned to face the 3 men directly. So now we're going to do something about parasites. Kongdae gestured to Jean, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. The sound of the zipper opening seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Jean extracted 3 thick manila folders and laid them on a folding table someone had dragged to the center of the circle. Yuri Volkov. You own a condo in River North. Value, $420,000. A BMW 7 Series. A boat docked at Monroe Harbor. Kongdae opened the first folder, revealing property deeds, vehicle titles, bank statements. Thomas Chun. Townhouse in Lincoln Park. $600,000. Investment portfolio worth another $200. David Park. Penthouse in the Gold Coast. $750. Plus a vacation property in Lake Geneva. He looked up, his eyes moving across each captain's face. Combined assets of roughly $2.3 million. All purchased with money that should have flowed through proper channels. All bought with blood extracted from people like Sarah Morrison. The three men stood frozen. Around them, the captains leaned forward, anticipating the order. Expecting Kongdae to claim these assets, to redistribute them through proper organizational channels, to make an example that everyone would remember. Instead, Kongdae pulled out a single sheet of paper from his own jacket pocket. Sarah Morrison, 34 years old. Single mother. One daughter, Lily, age 6. Current address, a one-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport with black mold and broken heating. He set the paper on top of the folders. Current assets, approximately $1,100 in savings. Current debt, $83,000 in medical bills from when her daughter had pneumonia last winter. He pulled a pen from his pocket. The sound of the cap coming off was like a gunshot. Jean has prepared the transfer documents. Every property, every vehicle, every bank account these three men own is being signed over to Sarah Morrison, effective immediately. The Sapphire Lounge itself, the building, the business, the liquor license, transfers to her as well. The warehouse erupted in shocked murmurs. Yuri's face went white. Thomas actually staggered. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. You want to run protection rackets? Kongdae's voice cut through the noise like a blade. You want to squeeze money from people who have nothing? Then you get to know what it feels like to have nothing. You get to start over with exactly what Sarah Morrison had before you put her in the hospital: debts, fear, and a child depending on you. He began signing documents, his movements precise and methodical. Each signature was a sentence being carved in stone. Sarah Morrison is now the owner of a restaurant worth $3 million and enough assets to never worry about $67 again. She's untouchable. Any captain who goes near her, any operation that even looks at her sideways, answers to me personally. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the assembled men. She's under my direct protection. Permanent. Non négociable. He signed the final document. Closed the folder. Looked at Yuri, Thomas, and David with something that might have been pity if it wasn't so cold. You three have 48 hours to vacate your properties. You keep your lives. You keep nothing else. Now get out of my city. 6 months later, the Sapphire Lounge looked exactly the same from the outside. Same velvet curtains. Same marble entrance. Same discreet security that kept the wrong element from wandering in. But inside, everything had changed. Kongdae sat at his usual table, the same one where Martha had watched him choose between monsters and men, reviewing quarterly reports. The numbers were extraordinary. Revenue up 18%. Protection payments flowing smoothly. Not a single business in his territory had missed a deadline or filed a complaint. The neighborhood was more profitable, more stable, and more loyal than it had ever been. And it had cost him nothing but 3 parasites and a reputation for unpredictability. Sarah Morrison emerged from the kitchen, moving with the careful grace of someone whose ribs still ached when the weather changed. She wore a tailored suit now instead of a waitress uniform, her hair pulled back in a style that spoke of someone who'd learned to command a room. The scars on her face had faded but not disappeared, a permanent reminder written in flesh. She carried a folder to his table. Set it down without ceremony. The Bridgeport Community Fund disbursed another $40,000 this month, she said, her voice steady and professional. Food pantry, winter coats for kids, 3 families behind on rent. All handled quietly. No one knows where the money comes from. Kongdae nodded, scanning the documentation. The fund was Sarah's idea, born from someone who understood what desperation actually looked like. 10% of the Sapphire Lounge's profits, redistributed through a network of churches and community centers. Invisible charity that bought something more valuable than fear, genuine loyalty. The other captains, he asked. Following the new protocols exactly.
No unauthorized elections. No freelancing.
3 of them have started similar programs in their territories. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Turns out people pay their debts more reliably when they're not being beaten for being short by the price of groceries. Kongdae had discovered something in those 6 months that 15 years of iron control had never taught him. Fear made people obedient, but hope made them invested. A neighborhood that saw you as a necessary evil would tolerate you. A neighborhood that saw you as a brutal guardian would protect you. The 3 men he'd exiled had tried to come back once. Word spread quickly about what happened to them. Now every captain in his organization understood that the old rules had been rewritten in blood and mercy. Across the dining room, Lily sat at a corner table doing homework, a bodyguard Kongdae had personally selected watching from a discreet distance. She wore a school uniform from a private academy, her face clean and healthy, the haunted look in her eyes slowly fading into something resembling childhood. Sometimes she looked up and waved at him. Sometimes he waved back. Martha had been right, as she always was. Pulling weeds was necessary. But so was knowing the difference between a weed and something worth protecting. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, her voice dropping. "The city council is investigating several of our competitors. Anonymous tips about labor violations, health code issues, protection rackets." She met his eyes. Someone's been systematically dismantling the operations that prey on working people. Kongdae closed the folder. Said nothing. Sarah nodded, understanding in the gesture. She turned to leave, then paused. "My daughter asks about you sometimes. Wants to know if you're a good guy or a bad guy." She looked back at him. "I tell her you're something more complicated than that. But I also tell her that the night you saved us, you saved a lot more than just 2 people." After she left, Kongdae sat in the silence of his empire, watching Lily bend over her homework with the focused intensity of a child who still believed the world made sense. The iron orchid was dead. But what had grown in its place was something far more dangerous. A man who'd learned that mercy, deployed strategically, was the sharpest weapon he'd ever wielded.